Welcome to the ATP Project. You're with your hosts Matt and Jeff, and today we have special guest Dr. Don Wood from the Inspired Performance Institute. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Wood.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We met back in Lake Tahoe when Matt and I were doing the Spartan Podfest, and you were on a panel that I was chairing, and we got to listen to your expertise and your unusual practice. And I say unusual in terms of I'd never really come across anybody who was helping people the way that you were. And I want to preference it very quickly. And people that have listened to the podcast will remember we spoke about a lady who was in your program who had been wrongly accused, had her estranged, and I think all sorts of horrible things. And I'll get you to recap, Dr. Wood. But I looked at that as being such a profound and powerful story that really inspired me and inspired a lot of other people and people that we've had listen to the podcast as well too. So, very quickly, could we just touch on that story and then go into your profession and what you do and how you help people?
Yeah, Sunny, her name is Sunny Jacobs. Sunny came to us from the Innocence Project. And the Innocence Project is a worldwide organization that helps people that they believe were wrongfully incarcerated. And they'll put up their legal defense. And so Sunny was accused, her and her husband, of murdering two police officers back in Florida. And what actually happened is they had nothing to do with it. They happened to be in the car when Sunny was asleep in the back seat with her baby and a 9-year-old son. When the car got pulled over, her husband was sleeping on the right side, but this gentleman that was driving the car had just been introduced, needed a ride. And so when the police pulled him over, he shot and killed them. And they woke up to this. And then he told them to get into the police car, and they went on a chase. And the police basically did roadblocks. They caught them. They fired at the car. And when the car finally crashed, Sunny was like, finally, okay, the police are here, I'm safe. But they arrested her and her husband and this guy. And this guy said they did it. And so they were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death.
Wow.
And put on death row. And her husband was actually executed on death row.
Oh my gosh.
And so he lost his life. And then 2 years later, she was then freed because the evidence showed that this guy had the gun, he did the crime, and then eventually he confessed to it. So for 17 years, Sunny was incarcerated, lost her husband, lost her children, in essence. They were taken away, so she couldn't raise her children. But she is an amazing human being, and she had heard about our program, and she said, I still have this trauma. Her big trauma was walking around the car and seeing the dead policeman. And so she just couldn't get that out of her head. And so I took her through our program, and we'll get into our program in a little bit. But the idea was that kept on looping for her and was creating a lot of stress and trauma. She said after going through our program, this is the only thing that has ever cleared that for me.
Wow. And
she says, now I can think about it without all that fear, where that wasn't possible. And Sunny's got an amazing story. She's probably maybe the most famous exoneree in the world because they've done plays in New York on her story, her life story. Brooke Shields, Susan Sarandon,
Wow.
Marlo Thomas, Kate Capshaw all played her.
Wow.
And she ended up meeting another gentleman after her husband obviously was executed. She fell in love with another man from Ireland who had also been accused and got exonerated from killing a police officer. And now they go all over the world helping people who've been in that situation. And her and Peter have their home in Ireland where they have exonerees come. And then they work with our program to also help them.
Because I guess, and I just love that story to sort of talk about the depths of people can resonate with the despair and the frustration and the hurt and the anger and the hate and the guilt and all these sort of emotions that would come from that. So using Sunny as a sort of a testimonial, if you like, to start up, and how you can really help people that are stuck. Do you want to just very quickly talk about your program and in essence what it is that you do to help people?
Sure. Basically, the genesis for the program was trauma. My wife and daughter had experienced trauma. I never did. So I couldn't understand why, after I married my wife, and I knew she came from a very dysfunctional, traumatic home. But in my mind, she's living with me. Why is she not getting better? Why is she still living in fear? And I could say something just like, no, I don't like that. And she would respond start crying and say, why are you mad at me? And I'd go, oh my gosh, like, how did you get I was mad at you from what I just said? And she said, well, the way you said it sounded like you were getting mad at me. You see, as a child, she had to learn so carefully to listen to the way her father spoke, because she had to recognize when he was starting to get mad, because that's when she was in danger. So she could hear this very slight change in my vocal pattern. And maybe I was frustrated with something from work that day, but I don't hear it. She hears it like, no, I don't like that. And so she kept responding with this fear. So I thought, what am I doing wrong? Why am I making this woman cry all the time? And I did, in my mind, I'm not doing anything. I'm just talking like you and I are talking right now.
Right.
But she could hear slight differences.
It's like Pavlov's bell for the dog. Like there's that association. This means that, even though obviously you were intending that, but that's the way that she had physically or emotionally become wired.
Yes. And so basically what I did is then my daughter ended up being diagnosed with Crohn's when she was 14. And then when she was 16, she told us about some sexual abuse she had when she was between 6 and 8 that we had no idea.
Wow.
And so they told us that she's going to have to change her diet, get off of gluten, get off of dairy. She'll be on medication all her life. And that's what we just thought was going to be the way. And then my wife really said, there's got to be a better answer. And that's what led us to start developing the program. And what I realized, there was a common denominator between my wife having Hashimoto's, burning out her thyroid, and my daughter having Crohn's. And what I discovered is it's all coming from trauma. And so the problem is that the trauma creates inflammation in the body. The inflammation affects the immune system and the neurotransmitters. So people are getting sicker because their immune system's compromised. They don't have a strong enough immune system. And it's also affecting their neurotransmitters, so they're feeling bad. So when they go to the doctor, they say, oh, I don't feel good. So they start putting them on a bunch of medications. Or my mental, feelings are really, I'm getting anxiety, I'm getting depression, all these things. They put them on other medications. And what I discovered is that it's the memory of the trauma that continues to loop. And when we have trauma, the result of trauma is inflammation. It's a protection system to protect the integrity of the system. It's developed to basically stop anything from infecting the cells. So for my daughter, it showed up in her intestinal area. That's where the inflammation went. And as long as we had this trauma unresolved, it kept looping and she kept thinking about it, it kept the inflammation active, because your subconscious mind has no relationship to time. So as long as it believes that there's a danger present, it's going to stay in that cell danger response. As soon as we get the trauma resolved, then the inflammation goes down, the immune system comes back online, and the neurotransmitters come back on, and the person feels better. However, the problem was for my daughter is that because she was so young and she didn't have enough life experience to interpret what had happened to her, she just held it in. And then when I started saying, okay, what we're doing with trauma is teaching people to live and manage and cope with it, as opposed to fixing it. So when I developed the program, I said, you know what? If we can fix the trauma, we can increase performance. Because when you feel better, you're going to perform higher. And the name of your program is perfectly. The ATP inside the cell, right, is also held in during that danger response. So they have less energy.
Wow.
As soon as we release the trauma, they have more power.
Yeah.
So for athletes, it's very interesting. We have a whole bunch of stories about athletes. And we met at the at Lake Tahoe,
yeah.
right? We did a podcast there, I had worked with Rob Killian.
Yeah,
I don't
Rob's
know if
great.
Yeah,
well, we sponsor Rob. He's a great athlete, and just love him. And love his mindset as well too. It's funny when you meet really, high performing athletes. Their mindset certainly is one of the factors you can see.
Yep. And so I worked with Rob on Friday before the World Championships, and then he won the World Championship.
Right.
Yeah. And what I said is, you're already a great athlete. I'm not going to make you a great athlete, right? But if I could give you a little 1 or 2% advantage by releasing a little more of that energy to have more focus. The key to performance is to stay present in the moment. And so what I wanted to do is, I said, I want to be able to keep you in an alpha brainwave state, right? Where your mind is actually super focused, but super relaxed.
Yeah.
That's where we perform at our best.
Yeah.
And we can do that. But we have to get the trauma resolved first, because the mind defaults to survival before performance.
So it's like a blockage. It's taking you out of the present.
So with we've talked a lot on other podcasts about the HPA axis, or the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic and that sort of stuff, and we talk a lot about immune and inflammation for different causes. But just correct me if I'm wrong, but so what we're saying here is that we get stuck into a survival mechanism. That trigger, it could be like you're saying before, that we hear it a certain way, or we perceive it a certain way. When we hear things, it acts like a trigger. So our emotional trauma or physical trauma of what we've been through, that creates a whole host of survival mechanisms, a whole cascade of things involving the survival nervous system, like the sympathetic nervous system, or shutting down the parasympathetic nervous system. Focusing a lot of resources in towards survival. And along with that comes the inflammation and the immune activation and everything like that. So all of these things combined, do you find that sometimes it might be someone might say something a certain way and that could trigger an event, but at another time they could get an immune trigger from, for example, a change of season, or the wrong food, or an injury, or something like that? And will that trigger or aggravate any sort of emotional or trauma, or put them back into a survival response? Do you find there's multiple triggers that can create that same survival response and keep people stuck, which makes it harder to break that cycle?
I believe there's the two systems. Basically, you're right. Most of it, I believe, is coming from memory, from the memory of the trauma. But it can also, if the vagus nerve gets activated, right? The vagus nerve has the dorsal and ventral pathways. The dorsal pathway activates its sympathetic nervous system. The mind is now interpreting through its senses that something is wrong, and then it activates your fight or flight response. If it interprets it that it's safe, it goes the ventral pathway. But the vagus nerve communicates 80% of its messages from the lower intestinal area. So if 80% of the messages from the vagus nerve goes to the brain, you can tell where that can get activated by something other than just the trauma.
Yeah,
and then just like you said.
And 80% of the immune system, being mucosal immunity, would have a direct activation towards that vagal nerve. And does that create that funny feeling in the tummy? When people describe, my gut shut down.
Butterflies,
yeah, same butterflies.
Because the vagus nerve, from a bit of taste buds of the tongue, through the digestive process, central sort of nerve, and that it could change totally how you feel in the gut immediately in response to stress, or even the wrong foods and that sort of stuff.
Yes. So that's one method where that can happen. But in my experience, that most of it is coming in from the memory trauma loop. When I was doing the research and putting this together, I found something called the time slice theory. And when I investigated and I researched this, I said that two scientists out of the University of Zurich said, is consciousness streaming? And most people would say, yeah, it's streaming. Like this information right now looks like it's a continuous flow of information. However, it's not. Your subconscious mind takes in 100% of the data in real time. But because your conscious mind, right, that logical, reasonable part, frontal area, could not handle that much detail. So the subconscious takes in all the information and sends relevant partial information in time slices, like clips from a movie reel. and it's sending that to your conscious mind. Now, what happens is there's a 400 millionth of a second gap in between your subconscious processing it and sending it before you're consciously aware of it. Now, here's what, when I saw that, I said, this makes perfect sense about what I know. As I said, what's happening in the 400 millionths of a second? And what I say is, the subconscious does a Google search.
Yeah.
What does this information look like, sound like, if we experienced it? And what does it do? It goes into memory. Now, when we have traumatic memory is stored differently than traditional average. Like if I asked you what you ate for dinner last night, can you tell me what you ate for dinner? No. Either one of you.
I was trying to think then. Mexican. I had Mexican stuff. I don't know what it was actually. Mexican though.
Right. So when I asked you that, you went into memory and you saw pictures, right, of what you ate or maybe where you were. That's how you stored the information about what you ate for dinner last night. No animal can do that. They don't store explicit details about events and experiences, but humans do. Now, because last night wasn't threatening, it was stored as a fairly low resolution file. But if that had been a traumatic event, all your senses are heightened: sight, smell, hearing. So how does it record it? High def. Then when your mind does a Google search and pulls in some of this high definition data that's been stored from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it's operating in the present. So when does it think that information's happening? Right now.
Yeah.
So it has to respond. It's designed to respond to a threat. But there's no threat. It's an information about a threat.
It's interesting. I can't remember, and Dr. Wood, I'm sure you'll correct me here. Was it Pythagoras or used to slap his students when he would tell them something really important? So what he would do is, and if he wanted them to remember it, he would literally come along, he would say what it was, and then he would slap them as a way of actually up-regulating the importance and the memory associated with that so that they wouldn't forget it. And that's pretty much what you're talking about, is creating trauma around an event, which then hardwires it, as far as access is concerned. Because typically, and I would imagine that a lot of this has got to do with our survival instincts. So things that are traumatic, things that are dangerous or perceived, we've got to learn from that. We've got to make sure that that thing doesn't kill us. So therefore, and I would imagine then that also then brings in reactions in the body, adrenaline and other states for that fight or flight readiness as well too.
Right. And what happens is anytime you have an emotion, a feeling, a sensation, or a thought, your mind is calling for an action. The purpose of fear is to escape a threat.
Right.
The purpose of anger is to attack a threat. So if you think about something that happened to you that was traumatic 10 years ago and you feel fear, that's a glitch. It's an error message.
Right.
Your mind is seeing it in real time saying, do something right now.
Yeah.
So I worked with a number of the Boston Marathon bombing survivors. And one particular lady who was 3 feet from the first bomb, Rebecca, as she started to talk to me about what happened that day, she was shaking and crying. And I said, do you know why you're shaking and crying right now? And she says, well, because I'm telling you what happened to me. And I said, right, but your mind thinks there's a bomb behind you and about to go off. Doesn't it make sense that it would try to warn you to get you to do something? By the time we finished in that 4 hours, she could tell me everything that happened that day and no fear.
Wow.
And so because we updated her mind.
Yeah. So the memory. So the big important thing is the memory change. The memory's still there, but the emotion attached to the memory has to change to break the cycle. Like we're not wiping memories or trying to reset or change or downgrade someone's perception of how bad it was, but just by understanding that you're okay right now, you're in a safe place, that's perfectly normal, there is nothing wrong with you. Of course you would react that way if you've been through this, but now you're safe, we can talk about it. Is that kind of part of the way of changing the emotion attached to the memory?
Well, we're actually not changing the emotion. What we're changing is updating the memory.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is you're in a beta brainwave state, a very active, brainwave state during a traumatic event. So your mind is the brain's taking in a tremendous amount of detail to that event. because it's threatening. So your senses are all heightened. It's taking in a tremendous amount of detail and recording it. And I say what it's doing is recording in high definition, which is a high brainwave state. The key to it is by the time I work with you on that particular memory, within a few minutes, I can get your mind to reprocess that memory into the same format as to what you ate for dinner last night. And it takes the activity out of it. So what it does is I move you into an alpha brainwave state to re-record or reprocess that information. When it goes back into an alpha brainwave state, you're safe. Because alpha is super relaxed, super, very concentrated, but very relaxed. That's where we want you performing, because you perform at your best.
And therefore, you wouldn't get that inflammatory and that immune activation along with that memory that would then aggravate and keep you in that stuck survival mode and that defensive posture and that inflammatory state, just by changing where the mind allocates that memory. Is that kind of fair? Yeah.
So for my daughter, it ended up in her intestinal area. Mm-hmm. After we resolved the trauma, she hasn't had a Crohn's flare-up.
Yeah.
She's not on any medication for Crohn's. And so she had a cyst formed on her ovary a few years ago, and the doctor said, I operated, there's no evidence you have Crohn's, but your chart says you have Crohn's. And she said, yeah, I have Crohn's. He says, but there's no evidence of Crohn's, and you're not on any medication for Crohn's. He goes, I hate to tell you this, you've never had Crohn's.
Wow.
And she says, no, I've had 4 resections done. I've gotten down to 90 pounds. I've had Crohn's. And he says, well, Crohn's doesn't go away. And I explained to him that when we calmed her nervous system down and got that memory reprocessed, the cell danger response went down, the inflammation went down, and her immune system came back in. And he said, no, that's impossible. He said, if that was true, you'd have a Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow.
And I said, well, tell me what Crohn's is. He says, Crohn's is a lifelong debilitating disease with no known cure. And I said, Crohn's is inflammation.
Yeah.
And the inflammation had been caused by the trauma. That's where it showed up for her.
There's a lot of interest. I mean, I became very interested in fasting and the effects that it had on cell replication and repairing broken DNA. And that fascinated me when I first heard about it. This is almost like an emotional state fast. This is almost like putting the body into a regenerative state through your emotional, because I know as well too, I mean, and again, we've spoken about this on other podcasts, I'm fascinated by the physical manifestation of emotion. One of the ones that we often talk about is the tension in the shoulders and the neck, but if you look at somebody with unforgiveness, someone who's bitter and twisted, as they say, you see these old people, they literally become hunched over. You talk about other people feeling things in their gut. I mean, I heard a story one time of a woman who just had inexplicable and scientifically could not understand why she consistently had fevers. But yet what she was saying to her children all the time was, oh, you're burning me up. Oh, you're burning me up. Oh, this is making me burn up. She was actually saying all the time, and obviously feeling the emotions, of that. I am fascinated between the link between emotional states and the physical impairment in the body or how it resides. I mean, you spoke before about your wife with the Hashimoto's. Can you explain maybe the link between the emotion of the trauma and how that you feel that may have manifested? Yeah,
the emotion is really a reaction to something that's happening. If there's nothing happening, we shouldn't feel an emotion, right? It's not, is the emotion appropriate for the response? A zebra cannot feel fear of a lion unless there's a lion present.
Right.
Oh, my lights went out. Sorry.
That's all right.
I wasn't moving. Can you still see me? Okay?
Yeah. Flick back
Okay.
again. That's all
actually
good.
Looks ghostly now.
It's kind of romantic.
Yeah, that's right. I want a candle. Yeah. So the reason my wife would be having emotions, like when I said, no, I don't like that, was because her mind felt threatened.
Right.
So if your mind feels a threat, it's going to create an emotion to get a response, to get you to do something. Like I said, the purpose of fear is to run. The reason Rebecca would be feeling fear is because her mind thought that there was a bomb, and your subconscious is literal. So when you're explaining where the lady is saying, right, you're burning me up, or however you describe that, right? The mind's literal, the subconscious mind. It doesn't say is something good or bad, right or wrong. It just takes it as it is, and it's fully present in the moment. So if a memory keeps looping, it's going to continue. So for my wife, she was in a constant state of fight or flight. So her cortisol levels were constantly being activated. Now, your fight or flight response is a perfect way to protect you in a threatening situation. And it's an emergency management system. But for my wife, it became an operating system. Mm-hmm. So it was turned on all the time. So she lived in hypervigilance all her life. And so that felt normal. So when I met her, she's high functioning, but she's suffering because she's feeling fear about everything. And so she could hear it. And we'd come out of a store and she'd say to me, wow, that clerk was so rude. And I'll say, how do you think she was rude? I didn't hear her say anything rude. She goes, well, didn't you hear the way she answered me when I asked that question? And didn't you see the way she put the clothes in the bag? She was constantly looking for signs that she was in danger, because that's the way her mind was trying to survive. So she could see it everywhere. And so if she's experiencing that and her mind is constantly saying, run, 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 it's going to aggravate the system. It's going to burn the system out. So it's like I say, if you get into your car and you want to go, 100 kilometers an hour, and you put your foot all the way to the gas, but then you say, well, I'm going to use the brake to keep you only going 30.
Right. Yeah.
You're going to burn out the engine, the transmission. It's not designed to do that.
Yeah.
The gas is on, right? And the brakes, so your parasympathetic are the brakes, your sympathetic are the gas. If you need to step on the gas to escape, step on the gas. But if your parasympathetic system is constantly trying to put the brakes on it, right, you're in this constant battle, right? And that's going to affect your health. It has to.
Yeah, absolutely. Waste of energy too. Can't be working.
Waste of energy.
Yeah, can't be working efficiently. So for athletes and everyone that wants to function at their best, it's more about, we often talk about, it's more about removing the handbrakes than pushing the throttle in many cases in regards to performance. So that's a perfect little analogy there too. Especially, and it's funny because when we get these operating systems, you talked about emergency management systems that become standard operating processes, all of a sudden we see how in the biochemistry they talk about the cortisol resistance, and we keep pumping out all this cortisol. It's no longer switching off our stress response, so we have to pump out more, and then it's not working to manage the immune system, so the body pumps out more, and then next thing you know, you're just waking up in an overreactive sort of state where you basically get stuck. So having these ways of your programs that you can teach people, you do a lot of that online. There's a TIPP program and there's a Neuro XP program. Are they things that you can teach people even here in Australia that have been through trauma or have had some early life events they can't get past, or even post-viral fatigue and that sort of stuff? Is it also useful in those sort of aspects as well, or are we mainly focusing on traumatic experiences?
No, because we want to be able to teach people to stay calm, stay present. Because if you read all the self-help books, they'll tell you, be present, be in the moment. But because of the way our mind is always in a survival mode, and it's activating this old memory, if you've had a lot of trauma, you're constantly going to be what people call triggers. You're going to be constantly triggering your sympathetic nervous system. And so what we want to do is, we have really two memory systems. We have our explicit memory, the way we store all the details. And then we have our procedural memory, which is how we learn to adapt to our environment. And so the survival is coming in if it gets triggered, right, by the memory of it, then it's going to get activated. Once we clear up that explicit memory, the way those pictures have been stored, we get it back into a low resolution file. Then through our TIPP program, we then work on a series of audios to train your mind, right, to constantly go into that parasympathetic system, right, so that it stays calm, stays present, stays in the moment. And so when you do that, you can train your mind to do that, and that's going to increase performance. It has to.
Yeah.
You got more energy, more power.
Yeah. And the parasympathetic nervous system is also very important for sleep quality, digestion, detoxification, hormonal management, all of the resetting and the recalibrating and rebooting aspects when we finally get out of that short-term survival mode.
Exactly. So you have to get into, we have our dream states. We have theta and delta. Theta is basically dreaming, where you're dreaming. Your mind's processing. So generally that's a state where whatever you did during the day, your mind's going to process it. But for my wife, it was also trying, and for a lot of people, it's also trying to process this unresolved trauma. So my wife never slept. I could walk in the room. I used to joke if I undid a button on my shirt, she would wake up because her mind didn't feel safe, so it didn't want to go into a deep sleep.
Yeah.
What she needed to do was get into a delta brainwave sleep, which is dreamless sleep, below 4 hertz, and that's where the maintenance gets done. So because I grew up in this childhood where my nervous system was always regulated, I was able to get into delta sleep. And if I'm getting 3 or 4 times the amount of delta sleep than my teammates, because I played hockey, right? Everybody used to just think I just healed fast. Well, the reason I healed fast is because I'm getting 3 or 4 times the amount of restorative sleep. And if you don't get that, and you're only getting 20 or 30% of that, no wonder it takes longer to heal.
Yeah, that's
Or we
that's
don't
great.
heal.
And I mean, that's good for everybody, not only from, a part of longevity, but also athletes as well too. I mean, again, if you're constantly living with this angst, I mean, Matt and I have a saying that if you're hating on somebody, if you hate somebody, that you're drinking poison and hoping that they die from it. I mean, this is a really interesting physical link between the emotions and the physical state. I just can't help but think of Sunny and the amount of emotions that she would have had, because it wasn't just obviously the trauma of seeing the dead police. There was the loss of the husband, the feeling of injustice, the hate that she must have felt. And again, everybody's different the way that they process. But how did you strip that away and get her to recognize that was in the past? And how do you deal with emotions like hate, which is really a toxic, horrible state to live in, because you have to forgive, right? Is that correct? I mean, and how did you get her to that point to go past, where it's not just about the trauma and the fear, so to speak, but the other emotions that came with it?
Well, one of the things I say is we don't have to forgive to heal. If we can get to understanding that the people who hurt us, right, were operating within their own sort of set of circumstances, so that life had been maybe very cruel to them, so they're angry, they lash out, they hurt you. But for my wife, she could never forgive her father. He hurt her too badly. But once I got her to understanding that her father couldn't have been any different based on the way his mind filtered through his experiences, his mind created his own unique set of responses or emotions, right? Now, that doesn't mean we're okay with it. We're not letting him off the hook. But when we get to understanding that these people who have hurt us could not have not done it, that their mind is constantly filtering through their, what I call atmospheric conditions, their own internal set of environmental conditions, the mind is going to respond a certain way. If you've been through that, your mind's going to go that way.
Yeah.
And so for Sunny, right, it was like these people didn't set out to hurt her, but maybe they've got pain. Maybe they've got something wrong. And so their mind lashes out, right, with that pain. The same thing when I deal with people in addiction. What I say is the first thing, our premise behind our whole program is that there's nothing wrong with anybody's mind. Everybody's mind is perfectly designed, right, to do what it's supposed to do, which is protect us, right? But if you have a whole bunch of events and experiences that are keeping the mind in an active fight or flight response, doesn't it make sense that your thoughts are not going to be the best thoughts?
Yeah.
Because I always say, if you have a filter and I pour water through the filter, the water's going to come out clear. That was my life. But if you pack mud in the filter and you pour the water through the filter and it comes out muddy, people would say, oh my gosh, what's wrong with that water?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's nothing ever wrong with the water.
Right.
It just filtered through the mud.
Yeah.
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 And if we get that filter clean, now it filters clean again.
Yeah.
And so getting the mind updated, getting these events to stop calling for actions, right? Then it operates peacefully
Yeah.
and stays present.
I've heard it explained slightly differently in terms of glasses. The way that you see things is like having different types of glasses. You've got, sunglasses, you've got rose-colored glasses, you've got, different strength lenses, and it's difficult because if you're walking around the whole time with, as you say, that filter on, you're not even aware anymore. I mean, it's like,
No.
And it just becomes such a part of you. It's not until you step back and actually, and again, maybe work with someone and actively be mindful to go, why do I perceive the things the way that they are? So in terms, sorry, Matt, you've got a question?
There's one thing that's been just leading into something I'm curious about, but we talk about that we start often with a trauma, the nervous system, of course, is involved. We have the inflammatory response, and then that can lead to immune dysfunction. I was a naturopath working in clinic for like 20 years. So we usually so we start from the other end, so we get these people coming in, I've been diagnosed with this Crohn's disease or this immune disorder. We start working on the immune system, working on ways to balance the nervous system, resolving inflammation. All of a sudden they remember this trauma, or all of a sudden it's like they've removed layers, and then next thing you know, it's like, man, I've never been the same since. And I usually start my naturopath consultations going, I said, do you ever like a never been the same since moment? And if it was always an emotional one, I freaked out because that's not any training or skills I had. So it's like, man, let me just look at this immune and inflammation, and then I'll send you to someone to talk through your emotional trauma. But do you find that there's a lot of people, especially entrepreneurs or athletes, that may come to you with the immune or inflammatory or required for performance with no understanding that they went through emotional trauma or memory of that or appreciation that it's all started with an emotional trauma? And then after you remove those layers of immune dysfunction and remove those layers of inflammation, it comes out that, oh man, I didn't get any hugs and kisses, when I was a kid, or, do you find that sometimes it takes, you got to remove layers for this stuff to become evident in their mind, that they understand there might be a trigger?
That's why, and my program is basically 4 hours. The first hour and a half is all on the education of why they're experiencing what they're experiencing. Because when they understand that it can be as simple, right, as clearing up these events and experiences as filter, that's going to change the way their mind responds. It has to, because the mind is now going to understand that they're safe. I never get sick. I've been healthy all my life, but my immune system was strong because I didn't have any trauma. I went through life without having any, so my nervous system was always being regulated as a child. So I grew up with that. That was normal. Being in homeostasis for me was normal. It wasn't that I get bumped off by something every once in a while, but I had learned as a child how to regulate very quickly. And I could come back into that balanced state where my wife, that didn't make any sense to her, because she'd be saying, I can't believe you'd even talk to that person who did that again, or that person who hurt us, or, why are you not worried about what's going to happen next week? And I go, why would you want me to worry about it, right? But that was the way she lived her life. So that felt normal, to be in that hypervigilance. And to me, that wasn't normal. Mine was to be in homeostasis. So I believe that she was trying to get there, but she couldn't, because every time she tried to calm down, the memory would keep looping of what happened with her father. And that would keep her out. And so when you're talking about that hate, when people feel that hate, what I say is, when you have an emotion like hate or anger, right, your mind is asking you to do something. What does it want you to do? It wants you to stop that person from hurting you. Well, that doesn't make any sense, because they're not hurting you. They hurt you, but they're not hurting you, right? So what do we do about somebody that already hurt us? Nothing we can do, right? It's over. It doesn't exist. It's just information about what do we need to do about World War II? Nothing, right? We should be able to recall that information. We learn from that information, but it should not activate a response from us of hate or anger or fear, because there's nothing happening.
Well, it traps you in a perpetual loop, because you're consistently then living in the past. You're living in, and there's no way that you can be present, live in the present, and you're dragging your past into your future. And if you keep doing that, literally you have created and I think you said a time splice, but you've created a time loop where you're just reliving and prolonging the abuse, the situation, whatever it was. And it's funny because that applies to so many things, and I'm not going to get political, but like there are so many things that have happened in the past that may or may not have been fair, probably haven't been fair. I mean, everybody's been hurt, but if you can't find a way to get past that, you've allowed that circumstance, that person, not only to abuse you and traumatize you at that point in time, but they have effectively, you have then allowed them to ruin your entire life.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people out there that are actively managing their dis-ease. So there's a lot of people out there that are supplementing and treating and training and are doing different forms of meditations, trying to balance nervous. There's so many people out there in the active process of managing the dis-ease, but without doing something with Dr. Wood and where he targets on that level of that memory, they're not getting to that cause, and they're just stuck into that loop where we're just stuck into a managing this dysfunctional operating system that has come from past traumas and that sort of stuff. So with the naturopath aspect, I mean, it was never a big part of any of our training. I mean, most of the naturopath stuff's a very, I hate to say it, but it's similar to a medical model where, you're taught to diagnose and prescribe, and they work out for different ways of explaining through biochemistry where the symptom picture is coming from, and then using tools to correct that or manage that rather than correct it. So I'll find that in this sort of instance, it's so important for anyone that just feels stuck. If you're doing everything right, you're putting in all the effort, you're taking the right supplements, you've done all your testing, you're managing, there might be an opportunity to go for a different level and work with someone like Dr. Wood on finding that emotion or that memory or that event or something that we might be able to reset and break that vicious cycle they're stuck in. And I reckon there is most people out there part of the or everyone in the sickness industry, but you probably find a majority of the people in the wellness industry are also stuck in that managing a dis-ease rather than rebooting and resetting. And I didn't think it was possible, to reboot and reset, in anything that we'd ever been taught. So,
and that's really what people have said. They're saying, you're eliminating PTSD like this, and I said, yeah. Eliminating panic attacks, yes. We've got all kinds of, if you look at all the testimonials on our site, people who have had panic attacks for 30 years, gone. People who had, like the Boston Marathon people, PTSD. I worked with a U.S. Army sniper who had to shoot and kill a 12-year-old boy. Yeah. And he'd been at the VA for 8 years. Yeah. And when I sat down with him, he said to me, I can't talk about this anymore. He said, I got arrested at the VA last week because they had brought me in and I started throwing tables and chairs. I can't take this anymore. I don't want to live. And I said, I'm not going to ask you to talk about it. I'm not going to ask you to get into a lot of detail. I says, we can actually get your mind to update without you even saying a word. I'll do it all visually for you if you want. And I says, but we're going to get your mind to reset that information. And so by the time he was just sobbing with me, by the time we were finished, he gave me in complete detail of what happened that day, including shooting the boy. And he goes, how the bleep did you do this? Why am I not feeling this emotion anymore? And I says, because for 8 years, your mind's been trying to get you not to pull the trigger because that would solve the problem. So my wife was always doing the same thing. She was what-ifing her life. What if I never did that? Yeah. What if I had have done that? Why we're experiencing this is because our minds are trying to reset it, but they don't know how to do it. But my wife would go through this what-ifing all the time. And I'd say, why do you do this? Like, that's such a waste of energy. And she's going, but don't you agree? It would have been better if we didn't do this. It would have been better if we had have done it this way. And I go, yeah, but that's an exercise in futility. Like, there's no point to it. But she did that, not because there was anything wrong with her, but her mind had been spending her entire life trying to fix what happened to her. And she couldn't do it. So you can see why, if her mind's looping through this trauma and it's seeing it in real time, why it would try to fix it.
Yeah.
It's an error message. It's a glitch. There's nothing to fix. It's over. It doesn't exist. It's just information. Once we get that reset, they can then describe. So my wife swore me to secrecy. I could never tell anybody about what happened to her as a child. This brings all kinds of shame and guilt on her, on her family, right? And I'd be going, no, it doesn't. Like, I fell in love with you. I don't care. Doesn't mean anything to me. But she'd go, oh, no. Don't ever tell anybody. So I never did. Once we went through this program, she'd sit on the show and tell you all about it.
Yeah.
It removed all the shame and guilt, because the purpose of the shame and guilt was to try to get it to stop.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
Yeah.
Because the emotion is a call for an action. So she would be trying to stop it, but she couldn't stop it until she updated it and stopped the memory loop.
You can see just how people get stuck. You can really see it, eh?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
It makes a total sense.
And interestingly too, like some of the other, again, back to the naturopathic stuff, because which is what I know, So with the naturopathic stuff, they often talked about the emotions linking to different body parts, and they'd always talked about the throat, where we don't, there's things that we don't want to say, or we hold stuff in there. They talk about the bowel linked in with not letting go and not moving on and that sort of stuff. Have you seen many other patterns along those lines where grief? I think they said grief was the lungs, the liver was frustration, the bowel was not letting go, and then the throat was not talking enough.
Yeah, but my wife, Hashimoto's, her throat, right?
Yeah.
So she could never speak. Right?
Yeah.
Very often children feel they lost their voice, they lost their ability to speak. I just worked with a lady yesterday from the UK. She went through the program online with me, and she had breast cancer, right? But her father never loved her. That's the way she saw it, right? So it was in her left breast.
Yeah.
And so I believe it absolutely goes there. For some reason, it went to that area for my daughter, into her intestinal area.
Yeah.
So it's going to show up. It's going to manifest itself somewhere in the body, whether it's cancer, autoimmune, something like that. It does show up because our bodies, as you know, our minds and bodies are designed to heal.
Yeah.
What's interfering with their ability to heal is the mind not taking enough time to do maintenance because it's being chased by a lion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. An
So you can
imaginary
run
life.
on jagged rocks,
Yeah.
right, as a lion's chasing you and feel no pain,
Yeah.
right? But once you escaped the lion and stopped, all of a sudden your brain and your mind, your body would be saying, okay, time to take care of this. We got to start doing some maintenance now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in regards to sleep, so that you mentioned before, if you're not, the fight or flight, and then people don't sleep. So it's like if you're not actually punching something and running, you should at least be hiding. Like, don't relax.
Yes.
Yeah, so you get stuck into those zones. So I keep interrupting. I'm getting very excited over all this.
I totally
Yeah.
agree. And it's a fascinating science. It really is. Sorry, were you going to say something, Dr. Wood?
What was that? No, I thought you were going to ask.
No. And in terms then of and we're running a bit short on time, and I actually do want to go back through and just talk a little bit about your history and how you got into this. Dr. Wood, where did you start from? What did you study? How much of this is that you've pioneered, and who did you follow, if anybody, down this sort of path? Is there anybody that sort of inspired you, or sort of, gave you some questions that you couldn't answer?
Yeah, it started because of my wife and daughter, right? When my wife didn't think she needed any real help. She's high functioning. She didn't get into drugs or alcohol, but she was just living in fear. And then when my daughter got Crohn's, and they kept saying, like, there's no real answer. You're just going to have to stay, on medication for the rest of your life, and eventually they'll cut off enough of your intestines, you'll have a colostomy bag. That's what the diagnosis was. Well, my wife researched everything, couldn't find any answers, and said, you really need, right, to start looking for answers for her. And I was adopted. So the first thing she said is, you got to find out your family history, because maybe it's coming from there. And so I started off with that. There was no family history of it. So what I said was, what's the common denominator? Is trauma. So I said, how much can this trauma be affecting us? So I really started studying trauma. So I looked into, EMDR, all these different things that we're working on it. Dr. Connolly is a brilliant trauma guy. I studied with him. And then I got my PhD in clinical counseling psychology, and then started saying, you know what? We're managing, treating it, and coping with it. Let's go down to why we're having to do that. What's causing it? And what I have found is that in almost every case, it's trauma. And the way the mind is constantly looping through the trauma, keeping that cell danger response active, the fight or flight thing active all the time. And so when I say to people, right, they'll say, oh, there's something wrong with me. I'll say, you couldn't possibly have not been in this position based on the way our minds work. It's designed to protect you. The reason it keeps going into this response is it has to, right? You don't choose to feel fear, right? That's not a choice. That's a response to a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So I work a lot with professional athletes. And, what I said, so one of the guys I work with, Kyle Schwarber from the Cubs, I was talking to him about this. And I said, so he was actually working out with his coach who was throwing batting practice to him. And the coach was behind a cage. And so the coach is throwing batting practice, and Kyle rips one right back at his head. But he's got a cage in front of him. But he ducks. So I stopped and I said, Kyle, let me ask you a question. Did your coach choose to duck? Right? Now, logically, he knows this ball can't hit him. There's a cage in front of him. So he can't possibly get hurt. Logically, right? He knows that. But survival will always override logic and reason. Mm-hmm. And so you can't stop this process no matter how much you think about it, no matter how much you try to meditate and do all these different things, right? You're not fixing the problem. The problem is an automatic response to a perceived threat. And the perceived threat's coming from memory. How could you stop that? Only way is to update the memory. That was what I found was the answer. Not, managing and coping with it.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And then so first of all, for the people out there listening that are relating to all of these stories, the first thing I need to know is there's nothing wrong with you. This is exactly what you should be doing. This is what you're designed to do, which is survive. The problem is how your memory or how your trauma has been filed into a survival trigger that you seem to be calling upon daily or constantly for a variety of triggers. So then how the hell did you learn how to recalibrate the brain? I mean, I can't even do that with a laptop. I don't know how you managed to teach people how to, so that's something you discovered yourself on ways of just resetting where it sits in regards to a boring memory or a major trigger in your life?
Yeah, it was just really from studying trauma and then adding our own procedures into it. I know that there's nobody else doing a 4-hour session. Right? Most of the times people go in for an hour, right? But I believe that what's happening is during that 4 hours, I'm moving them into a very relaxed state, into a very safe state. And then I'll say, okay, give me a 2-minute description of one of those traumas. Now you can tell me about it, right? We can have you not tell me about it. It's not important for me to know what happened. It's only important for your mind to start the process of resetting it. So for Rebecca, I had her go through a particular set. We did it all visually. So I have her do 10 pictures. But while she's in this state, I have her recalling the first picture is before the event started. The 10th picture will be it's over and she's safe. And then whatever 2 through 9 are, I have her just let her mind, and then I'll say to her with her eyes closed, okay, see picture number 1, she's not describing it. Picture number 2, I go through all 10 pictures, then I repeat the 10 pictures, then I go backwards in the 10 pictures, and then I mix up the pictures. So what ends up happening is the mind starts to understand that this isn't real, right? Yeah. And when it's in an alpha brainwave state, if it goes, if this isn't real, right, it reprocesses it back into that very calm, peaceful state. And then when they open up their eyes, I'll say, now go back over that event and tell me, do you feel an emotion when you think about it? And they'll go, how did you do that? And I'll say, well, the mind no longer sees the high definition to it. It's not threatened by it. So this is just information. I have a whole series of techniques like that.
Wow.
Because people remember the craziest stuff. They'll describe smells.
Smell is a very powerful.
Texture and noise. We all know certain music, just takes you back to a time and that sort of stuff. But a lot of these people with their traumatic events, and they start describing it, the details that they can, texture of things that they were touching at the time. Some of the details in those memory is just so full on. So it makes so much sense when you talk about it being recorded in high def. This is a bit beyond high def. There's multiple senses involved into this thing.
Right. And what we do is we're activating the whole brain, all the senses when they're in this alpha state, and the mind reprocess. I had a lady who got raped, and there was a song playing on the radio. Every time she heard that song, this is 20 years after the rape. Yeah. She says, my stomach was so turning and churning. She said, I'd have to turn the song off.
Yeah.
Now, why is her stomach doing that? She's not being raped. right?
Yeah.
But the mind is recalling the information about the rape. And when is that happening? Right now.
Yeah.
And so her mind would be now feeling as if it was happening. I've had women who've been raped feel the pain of the rape while they're going through. And that's why I only do 2 or 3 minutes. I don't need any more than that. The mind will actually reset that fast. And we do 2 or 3 events. And then what I say is the mind will reset everything else when it goes into theta tonight, because your mind processes in theta what it just learned. So I had a lady who had multiple sexual assaults when she was a child. We worked on 3. And then she said, I hate to tell you this, we're going to be here all day because I've got a lot of these. I said, we don't need to do any more. We're going to move on. And so she said, well, don't we have to go through each one and clear it? And I said, no, we don't. Your mind now understands this process. It's designed to heal. It'll process this information. So I ran into her by accident at a store a month later. And she came over to me. She says, I got to tell you something. She says, I was no question I was feeling better. We actually really did a lot. That was great work. And I was feeling better. But she says, when you told me my mind would clear everything else, even though we didn't talk about it, she says, I'll be honest with you, I didn't believe you. She says, but I was at Universal Studios on the weekend with my daughter. And I was on the escalator and I was looking over the railing. And my daughter said, Mom, look at what you're doing. And she says, I never told you I had a fear of heights. And it's gone.
Wow.
So whatever event created the fear of heights got processed as well. And that's like, and as you know, as a naturopath, we're designed to heal.
Yeah.
All we have to do, if you came in with a broken leg, what would you do? Reset it, right? And you don't have to do anymore. The mind and body now will take care of it and it'll heal it on its own. It's just gotten caught in a loop. And so if it's in this constant threat, right, of being chased by a lion and you're trying to get it to do maintenance, it's not going to do it. It's not going to fix anything until it gets away from the danger. But it never gets away from the danger.
You know, we've got 2 more podcasts, I reckon, here, because I would love to do one on sports and performance. I know you mentioned Robert Killian, and I know a lot of our listeners would love to understand how to perform better at sports. The other one that I'm really interested in, and you sort of touched on a little bit there, is around trauma, specifically for really young people that have been traumatized and DID. And have you done much work with DID? That's just
not a lot, but I've done some.
Yeah,
but the same kind of thing, right? It's coming from trauma. Schizophrenia is coming from trauma.
Yeah,
all those things are coming from that. That's my experience.
Yeah,
that I think sexual abuse is a pandemic around this world.
Absolutely,
and that is creating millions and millions of people to dysregulate.
Yeah,
right. Their nervous system is not feeling safe. Happened to my wife, happened to my daughter, and I saw firsthand, what happened to them. And I can tell you that so many people that come to see me are telling me the same story over and over and over.
The thing,
right? It's a common.
Yeah, and it is the amount of abuse that's happening out there is scary. I think the thing for me is that there is, especially with dissociative identity disorder, which is split personalities and things like that. Like there's a great movie actually called Sybil. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Where
Sybil?
Yeah, with it was done back in, I think, the late 70s or early 80s.
Sally Fields.
Sally Fields, that's right, yeah. And I forget the other lady. She should have got an Academy Award for it. But in terms of...
And you forgot her name.
The mother, was it Faye Dunaway? I forget. Anyway, so the occupational therapist. But in terms of... I've heard that when children... specifically when they don't have the ability to communicate or verbalize it, that this is where the body again creates a coping mechanism. It's inbuilt to disassociate from that person, which is where multiple personalities and split personalities come into it.
Yeah, right.
It's fascinating. It's something that my wife and I have been looking into in terms of, the abuse and these people, and they seem to get stuck really badly. I'm just thinking, obviously, your ability to be able to help people that are stuck is pretty profound. I was just wondering if you'd worked with many of them. So,
like I said, I have primarily most of the work are coming in from higher functioning people who are just struggling with, anxiety, depression, panic attacks, anxiety attacks. But it will work for, the most extreme cases. I worked with a young lady who being diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she was really struggling. And as I told her, I said, there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your mind. Your mind has become disorganized because it's so threatened. It can't handle these threats, and it doesn't know what to do with them, so it's become very disorganized. And I said, so when we can get your mind to calm down, I believe Finland are doing some incredible work with schizophrenia.
Right.
In the way that they're dealing with it. They're not treating them with all kinds of medications and that they're broken and defeated.
Right.
They're taking an approach of, we're going to sit with you, we're going to bring in people who are going to make you feel safe. And the key is they don't feel safe. So as I was actually talking to her about it, and I was saying, if we could get your mind to start feeling safe, we can get some of these updates done, a lot of these things should start to settle down for you. And she started to cry. And I said, I can hear you're crying. I was just on the phone with her. I said, tell me what's going on. She says, you just gave me hope, right? That's what they're looking for. So there's hope that there's an answer, right? And I believe, schizophrenia, all these different things, DID, are all coming in from just a dysregulation of the nervous system because it can't handle it. It was just too painful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's trying to protect them.
We've run out of time, but what I would love to do is,
let's do more.
I think that we should definitely get Dr. Wood back on, and I'd love to have Ken Ware at the same time.
Oh, imagine
because Ken worked with a lot of the bombing victims in not Boston, in Manchester.
Oh yeah.
He's he has the Neurophysics Institute. He's worked with paraplegics, getting them out of wheelchairs, and the amount of work that he does on the mind, there's such an overlap between what you're doing and saying and what Ken says, and both of you, to me, it's relatively new science and pushing the boundaries, and really is the world needs to know more about the power of the mind. We always say mind over matter. We always talk about, if you think you can, you can. If you think you can't, you can't. And I think the problem with too much reliance on drugs and putting a Band-Aid over the situation, I would be fascinated to have you both in the room at the same time talking about performance and talking about, that sort of stuff. I think would be fantastic, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So would you come back, Dr. Wood?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'd love to. And like I say, our goal is performance, right? When you tell people that there's nothing wrong with you, what's interfering with your performance, right? It's the way your mind keeps looping through this. That's hope.
Yeah.
That we can fix it.
Yeah. Right.
I had a gentleman, he was a veterinarian. He had a car accident. He lost his left leg above the knee, and he'd been suffering for 10 years. He had to be in a wheelchair. They couldn't get a prosthetic on him. And so when he came to see me, the first thing he said to me, he says, will this program help me get off my oxycodone? He said, I'm so depressed, I can't even get out of bed anymore. I don't want to do it anymore. And he said, will this help me? And I said, let's talk about it when we're finished, right? Because I'm not an MD. I can't tell him to take medicine or not take medicine.
Right.
And so when we finished it, he was definitely feeling better. And he said to me, I'm going to ask you again, will this medication help me, or this help me get off this oxycodone? And so he said, the words you said to me, his name is Mario. You can see him on our website. He says, what you said to me saved my life. He said, Mario, you can stop anytime you want to. And he said, now you can imagine, oxycodone.
Right.
He said he got into the car. He said, I took one because I was in some pain because I was sitting there for so long. He says, and I immediately regretted it within 5 minutes of driving the car. He said, I went home. I told my wife, let's get the pills. We're going to flush them down the toilet. He flushed all his pills. He shredded all his prescriptions, and he hasn't touched it. It's been 1.5 years.
Wow.
And I just got some pictures from him. I mean, he stays in contact with me all the time. He's going back into his veterinary business. He was just in Las Vegas at a show, right? And he's having the time of his life. He keeps saying to me, he said, that day changed my life forever.
Great.
Now that's the mind.
Yeah.
Right? Having the power to say, I can stop. The mind can do whatever it needs to do.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Dr. Wood, for people that are interested to learn more about your programs, could you please tell them where to go on the web or Facebook, or please let us know.
Absolutely. I think we sent you some show notes that you guys would be able to give them some information on how to reach us or get in touch with us. You can also check out our YouTube page. You'll see a lot of the testimonials. You can link into that, or our website. Great. And check out our Facebook.
What are people typing in?
So it's www.inspired, with a D, performanceinstitute.com.
Great. Great.
And
So
you can see all that and check it out. And I think based on the show we were doing, so if anybody wanted to do our online program or Zoom session or whatever, I think with your show we were offering a discount to do that. So
perfect.
you can check that out.
Yep, and we'll get all that information up onto our website. And look, yeah, we're out of time, but look, thank you so much, Dr. Wood. It's been fascinating. I mean, I always learn a lot from these things.
Yeah.
And I'd love to have you back again, and we'll get some feedback from our viewers as well too, and our listeners about what they want to hear about. But I definitely would love to do more on performance as well too.
Absolutely.
But look, thanks so much for your time. It's really good to see you again.
Yeah, great seeing you. Thank you for your time. I love talking about this, obviously. So
Absolutely. The world needs to hear it, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks again, Dr. Wood. And we'll definitely have Dr. Wood back on. Hopefully, we could organise the same time with Kenware. And
Imagine if we could have him at the summit. Imagine our summits.
That would be great.
Anyway, we'll talk more about that.
Great.
I'm getting excited.
All right. Well, thanks again. And we'll be back with
and I was just going to mention Australia is probably, we got a lot of people coming from Australia. It's quite amazing.
Oh,
I just had I mean, you guys are really advanced in some of this stuff in the neuroscience, I guess. So that's where people are starting to look for more answers. So we've getting a lot of interest from Australia.
Definitely think there's a correlation there, definitely, between Ken and Dr. Wood. I think there could be a really good synergy.
Imagine it.
But yeah, all right. So anyway, please check out Dr. Wood's webpage, and we've got some specials as well too to give away for people that are interested. 20% off.
Wow.
Fantastic. And
Wow.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks, Dr. Wood, and we'll be back with more soon.
All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.